Welcome, everybody. So for those of you for whom it's the first time you're joining us, Mondays at the Mess is a talk series run out of Richmond Barracks in Inchicore, which is a neighbourhood hub that celebrates the rich stories and experiences of the local community, past and present. And that's run by Dublin City Council Culture Company, which runs cultural initiatives and buildings in the city. And some of you might be familiar with Goldenbridge Cemetery, which is right beside the barracks there, owned by the Glasnevin Trust. And it is that cemetery which inspired the theme of this talk for this evening. So my name is Kate, and in a few moments, I'm going to hand you over to today's speaker. So our speaker today is Pat Garry. Pat is a guide with Dublin City Council Culture Company, working at 14 Henrietta Street and Richmond Barracks, giving tours of the buildings and also of Goldenbridge Cemetery. He was born, raised, and spent most of his working life in the Liberties area. He was a chairman of the Liberties Festival and the South Inner City Development Committee. He's been a tour guide for over 40 years and is presently developing a number of tours of the North Inner City. So without further ado, I will hand over to Pat and enjoy the talk.
So, now I started off when I was doing this talk first. I started off, it was Dublin burial grounds from Goldenbridge to from Bully's Acre to Goldenbridge. What actually happened during the summer, I happened to be up in Mount Pellier where the Hellfire Club is, and I was looking down and I saw that there was remains there of an old burial mound. You know, we're talking about Bronze Age, up to 4,000 years old at this stage, nearly as old as the pyramids, and they exist all over Dublin. Now, this is the Hellfire Club. Now, when the Speaker Colony was building the Hellfire Club around 1725, the story is that the first roof he put on actually exploded and blew up into the firmament because he had used stones from a grave or a fairy fort to build the roof, and he had to replace the roof then at a later stage. Now, if you look at it, it's still visible today. This is excavations going on 2 years ago to try and discover a cyst grave. Now, a cyst grave, and we're talking about very small uh, compartment inside the center of that large ring there, and I'll be talking about 18 inches by 18 inches by 18 inches, very small size, into which would have been a stone floor, 4 stone walls, and a stone cap, and into that would have been usually put 2 jars. One jar would have contained the remains of the deceased, usually cremated, and the other would have contained some food for the afterlife. Now, this is another one in the Dublin Mountains, to Braddon, and you can see that was excavated around the 1850s, right into the centre there. Again, the same thing was found, a small urn with some remains in it, and it seems to have been the situation at the time, right up until Christianity came to Ireland, that when it came to disposing of the corpse, cremation was the preferred way at those stage. This is Kilmashog. Now, this wasn't discovered until the 1950s. It's only a stone's throw from Dublin, not too far from Rathfarnham, and you get some idea of what a cyst grave is like. You can see it there, small little box made of stones, and inside that would have been put the two urns that I was talking about. There you can see it now. If you walk around there, it's not too far away. It's very hard to know exactly what it is. It just looks like a mound of stones. This is another one. This in the Phoenix Park, Knockmaroon. If you go up that way, it's another burial site that we have around Dublin. So all of these indicate that there were people living in Dublin and looking after the dead and respecting their dead thousands of years ago. Now, this is a map. Now, you wouldn't show this to anybody today, but it shows where a large number of these cyst graves have been found. Drimna was a huge number found around Drimna, the Green Hills, Crumlin, Temple Oak, and Mount Venus, all around. And some of the higher ones, if you stand in one place, you can see the next one, you can see the next one, you can see the next one. They're almost sort of an inter-visibility attached to them all. And I've put the names down there. Now, Tala there, you look at the name Tala, it's probably one of the oldest place names that we have in Dublin. Now, there's a story about the invasions of Ireland, the way to explain the invasions of Ireland and the number of people who came to Ireland. The first people to invade Ireland are supposed to be people who Noah wouldn't allow on his boat, and they had to find their way. They came to Ireland. I think it was 50 women and 3 men. 2 of the men died. The last man left, ran away. So obviously the race died out. And then another race came after that, was called the Partholonians. And they were doing all right, living around the Dublin area. And at their height, there was 5,000 men and 4,000 women. But a plague set upon them, and they all died within a week. And they were buried in Tala. And the old name for Tala was Tolacht Muincher Partalon, the burial place of the Partalonians. And apparently there was only one man left to bury all his kinsmen, and he lived for apparently a couple of hundred years in various forms. This is what the myths tell us. But other names that I have there, Kilmainham, we'll be talking about that again. That goes back to Kilmainham, found the monastery there in the year 606. Donnybrook, there was a burial ground there from about 700 until about 1880s. Kilnamanagh, founded by St. Kevin himself, and Killininy, there was also burial mounds there as well. So you get some idea. And if you look at that map of Dublin, south side of Dublin, quite a lot of very old burial grounds around. Now, also we have some of the biggest Viking burial grounds outside Scandinavia. Uh, I think we do in Dublin. We certainly do. So here when they were digging for the digging for to build the War Memorial Gardens in the 1930s, they came across a very large burial ground there. And I didn't bother showing the remains or anything like that, but you get some idea what it's like. It's quite a big and it's an impressive cemetery. Also, prior to that, in the 1830s, when they were digging for the railways, same place around Kilmainham, along the banks of Liffey, they also found big or large Viking burial grounds. Now, this is the inner city. It's taken from a map, and you can get some idea of the number of burial places that existed in Dublin. Now, there were small burial grounds, usually confined to parishes. Now, I haven't shown them all. There's another one in St. Patrick's. There's some private burial grounds as well that aren't shown on that map, but you get some idea. Now, all of these graveyards were small, all attached to churches. This is St. Catherine's in Thomas Street. It's not the biggest cemetery in the world, in use for the best part of 800 years. You can imagine the thousands of people that were being buried there. Also, when you look in there, there aren't very many headstones. Now, nowadays, people buy plots and they buy them in perpetuity, they buy them forever. In those days, when this was, a couple of hundred years ago, you were buried wherever there was an available place. So your grandparents could be one place, your aunt another, your uncle another. There was no continuity in actual burial plots for anybody unless you were very, very wealthy. This is St. Andrews. Now, unfortunately, an awful lot of these ancient burial sites, and we're talking about hundreds, some nearly 1,000 years, they're not shown very much respect nowadays. This is St. Andrews. The car is taking precedence over people's lives and things that mattered at one stage, and that's a nice part of this cemetery. There's another part where it's just an absolute bits. The headstones are just thrown in a horrible way. This is the cabbage garden. Now, some of them are treated with a bit of respect and dignity. This is the cabbage garden. Now, the cabbage garden here is about since the year 1666. It gets its name, by the way, when Cromwell came to Dublin in 1649. He stabled his horse in St. Patrick's Cathedral. His troops apparently wanted to grow their favourite vegetable, which was cabbage, and they grew it here in the cabbage garden. Then after that, it became a cemetery, mainly a Huguenot cemetery. We know that now, by the way, there's about 3 or 4 Huguenot cemeteries around the city, certainly 3 that we know of. Now, what happened when the city council took her over in the early 70s? They moved the headstones to the side of the walls there, and I remember there one winter day, and it was really frosty, and the frost had gotten behind the tombstone. And what happened? I just turned her head an awful crack, and the frost had actually cracked one of the tombstones. Now, this is two that I came across. When you take photographs and then you're looking at them later, and I didn't realise what these said at the time, but the one on the left, here lieth the body of Mr. Francis Smith of Yecombe, merchant, who departed this life on the 30th of March, 1766. Here lieth 14 of his children. The one on the right, now I just say this because the amount of times that the man Richard Field is named in this, and by the way, we spell Field differently today. This stone and burial place belongs to Richard Field of Francis Street, the city of Dublin, and his posterity. Here lieth the body of the above Richard Field, who departed this life on the 22nd of April, 1745, aged 52 years. Here also lieth the body of Anastasia, daughter of the above Richard, departed this life on the 28th of March, 1757, aged 29 years, with several of their children. Here also lieth the body of Edward Field, son of the above Richard, departed the 6th of May, 1748, aged the 8 years. You get some, I mean, that guy obviously liked himself to some extent. Now, this is one, you won't see this if you go now because time and corrosion have unfortunately destroyed most of what's here. And it's very unusual for a Dublin tombstone. First of all, at the top, you've got that strange attempt at a skull and crossbones. And also on the right there, you see what looks like an hourglass or an egg timer. You know, now that goes back to 1721, and it's a weaver who lived on the Coombe, but unfortunately, through erosion and weather, uh, you can't really make out anything on that now. Now, burial for Roman Catholics was a major problem. After Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in 1539, Roman Catholics had to be buried in Protestant graveyards. Now, it was a lucrative form of income for the Protestant minister. Naturally, be more Catholics in the country than Protestants. The Protestant minister was more than happy to accommodate the Catholic corpses, but there was a rule: no priests or no prayers. Now, this is St. James's in James's Street, probably the most ecumenical of all the graveyards in Dublin. By the way, this graveyard is still open. You can go in, it's quite nice. They've done an excellent job on it. But because there was no priest or no prayers, what happened was the Roman Catholics would walk around the fountain here, and 3 times they'd say the prayers, and then the departed would be brought into the graveyard to be interred in the graveyard. Now, this is another grave. This is St. Mary's. Now, it's more like a prairie now at this stage. It's hard to believe that it was once a graveyard, but it was a heavily overcrowded graveyard. This is a letter that was written to the papers, the Dublin Evening Mail, and it's from a Mr. Ardell. And he starts, he's talking about burials. The evil to be remedied, which I think demands serious attention of the government and of every person, is the practice that now prevails of having burial in churchyards within the city, surrounded as they are by neighbourhoods densely populated, the inhabitants of which are constantly inhaling an atmosphere noxious in its character and effect. I have attended funerals where the remains of 7 bodies were exhumed to make room for an 8th about to be interred. And I would ask any rational man if he could expect that a city could be healthy where such scenes were of frequent recurrence. In no country, save in Great Britain and Ireland, do interments take place within the walls of cities or towns. On the continent of Europe, such an offence against propriety is unheard of. Amongst barbarous natives, as they are termed, the dead are either consumed by fire or interred at a distance from their dwellings. But in refined and civilized Ireland, the pernicious system is yet tolerated. Now, it was a major problem in Dublin, but not only in Dublin, most of continental Europe, I know the man says it, continental Europe, but also in places like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, inner city cemeteries were becoming majorly overcrowded. This is the scene of a famous episode in Daniel O'Connell's career to establish a graveyard. This is St. Kevin's. Now, it's established by St. Kevin himself. It's off Camden Road there. The entrance used to be off Kevin Street up Church Lane. The church ceased to be used in 1912 when they built a new St. Kevin's on the South Circular Road, and it was here that the Duke of Wellington was actually baptised. And in 1724 or 1825, a funeral took place here of a John Darcy. Now, he owned a brewery in Thomas Street called the Anchor Brewery. He was a well-liked, well-known man, and when it came for the priest to follow in to say the prayers at the over the grave, the sexton stepped in. He said, "Under no circumstances can you come in here." Now, the funeral was carried on with dignity and aplomb. The viceroy got to hear about it. Wellesley, he happened to be the Duke of Wellington's brother, and he happened to be married to a Roman Catholic. He was furious, and he petitioned Parliament for the right for Catholics to establish their own cemeteries. Now, this is the Royal Hospital, the gates of the Royal Hospital. Now, while Catholics didn't, for poor Catholics who couldn't afford to have their loved ones interred in Protestant cemeteries, this was Bully's Acre. Now, it's by the way, we use the term acre in Dublin with absolutely no meaning. We've got another cemetery, the Croppies Acre on the Keys. And we talk about the 15 acres, which is nearly, have made 10 times that size. So in Bully's Acre, this is where the poor of Dublin went because you had no burial fees, but you had to choose carefully where it was that you were going to be buried. So this is what it says outside. One of Dublin's oldest cemeteries, Bully's Acre features a large 10th century decorated granite cross shaft possibly the remains of a boundary cross or termen associated with St. Mainan's Monastery, founded in the year 606 AD. According to tradition, Brian Boru camped here before the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Tradition also claims that following the battle, the body of his slain son Murragh and grandson Torlock were interred near the cross. Dan Donnelly, the boxer, was buried here, as was Robert Emmett, whose remains lay overnight pending removal to an unknown resting place. The burial ground was in use from the time of St. Mainan up to the year of the Great Cholera epidemic in 1832, when it was closed to the general public. It contains remains of monks, knights, princes, and Dublin citizens. It was popular with the poor as the common ground where burial could be performed without charge. Traders, merchants, and wealthier citizens were also buried here, attached to the holy ground associated with the monastery. Only about 70 tombstones now remain, ranging in date from 1764 to 1832. The majority of those buried in Bully's Acre were poor, and their graves were left unmarked. Now we know that Robert Emmett was taken away somewhere else to be buried. His family kept vigil overnight. And remember, it wouldn't have been pleasant. He was hung, drawn, and quartered. So he probably would have been in a number of parts while he was up there. We know that Dan Donnelly's body was stolen. And we know that his arm up on quite recently was on display in a pub down in Kildare, I think it's Kilcullen, and the rest of his body was used for medical science. Now you get some idea. This is the Royal Hospital. The burial ground is at the front there, and you can see the St. John's Road has been put in since. The Liffey banks have been straightened. You know, the Royal Hospital ground used to go down to the Liffey, but with the coming of the railway, they lost the right to do it, access to the river, and the Liffey itself was straightened. But it's not a very big graveyard. Yeah, thousands upon thousands of people were interred here. There's the High Cross where Brian Boru's son and grandson are supposedly buried. Now, cholera disease, all sorts of disease were a problem. This is the Great Cholera Plague of 1832. That's what led to the closure of Bully's Acre. You just couldn't accommodate the amount of corpses that were being brought up to the graveyard. Other times, between 1816 and 1819, there's 70,000 people killed from typhus in Ireland, greatest in 1817, and it was spread by beggars and wakes. And during the time of the famine, it also occurred as well from 1846 to 1849. Now, the thing about the 1816, 1819 one was apparently Our Lady appeared in a chapel in County Cork. She left 3 piles of ashes, and the instructions were that 3 named families in Cork were to take these ashes, light a fire, and the next day, they were to give the ashes to somebody else, to other 3 families. And of course, I couldn't think of a better way to spread disease by personal contact, but apparently that's what happened, and that's how this disease spread, mainly around Munster, but also to the rest of the country as well. This is Cork Street Fever Hospital. That was built in 1812, and that was to accommodate people who suffered from the various diseases. And in one year, it actually, I think 1816, it took, or 1816, it took in 2,200 people, you know. Now, as I said, burials in inner cities were a problem all over Europe. The gravestones were very congested. They were an offence to the eyes and the nose and the senses. They attracted vermin. The smell, miasma, was appalling. And one of the last acts of Louis XVI was to close this cemetery here in Paris as the Cemetery of the Innocents. And he declared that the bones were taken up. They were put in the catacombs under Paris, which were formerly mines, by the way. And when they were clearing out that cemetery, large blobs of human fat were discovered. And some enterprising guy took these large blobs of human fat. He had them made into candles and into soap, and he sold them. And who do you think would buy them? They were actually bought by burglars, because burglars believed that if you washed yourself in this soap, if you took one of those candles when you broke into a house, you were invisible. So that was the belief there, like, you know. And if you go to Paris today, as you walk on, you can now do a tour of these catacombs. As I said, they were former mines. You can see all of these millions of people, you know. They reckon that there's up to 6 million people in the catacomb, or remains in the catacombs of Paris. Now, no finer man to do something about burial problems than Napoleon. Now, Napoleon, he came to power in 1804. One of his first things he actually did was he wanted to establish four cemeteries around Paris, north, south, east, and west. He expanded two of them, Montmartre and Montparnasse, and he built this one, Père Lachaise Cemetery, which is probably the most visited cemetery uh, in the world. And there's a story about being the first to be buried in a cemetery. It's supposed to be bad luck if you're the first to be buried there. It's said that seven generations of your family will end up in purgatory, and that's quite daunting enough. Now, I think they've done away with purgatory since, so that's not a problem anymore. And the usual thing was that when you were up in the cemetery, that a virgin had to be buried there. Now, Napoleon, a young girl had died, so that solved one problem. And the other problem, he just disinterred a number of famous people from other cemeteries around Paris, and he had them reinterred there in Père Lachaise, and he started a footfall of people going to this concept of a garden cemetery, not an overcrowded cemetery, a garden cemetery. He had prints put out to show people what it was like, the beautiful rural settings, the nice way you were going to go. And by default, also, he established the undertaking trade, which didn't exist when you didn't need undertakers when people were buried so close to home. So this was established by default as well. Meanwhile, in Dublin, we still had problems with overcrowded cemeteries, and one of the aims of Daniel O'Connell was to try and establish a cemetery for the Catholics of Dublin. You know, not just Dublin, but Ireland as well. And he sought the repeal of the penal laws, which prohibited Roman Catholics from having their own burial grounds, owning property, voting, attending Parliament, and things like that. He was very successful. In 1829, the penal laws were done away with. Now, he had a problem. He wanted to build a graveyard, but the problem is trying to buy the land. He found it extremely difficult, or the committee found it extremely difficult to buy the land. Now, he bought the land, as it turned out, quite close to Richmond Barracks. Now, Richmond Barracks was built in 1814 because Napoleon was coming to power. Well, he was in power, but he was more and more powerful. It was built to house troops because there was a genuine fear among the British that Napoleon would invade Ireland and use it as a backdoor to attack England. So what he actually did, this barracks was created to try and to have enough troops there to repel Napoleon if he did invade. So the graveyard was created at the back of Richmond Barracks, a garden cemetery. Now, most people don't associate Napoleon Bonaparte, with having a big effect on any area of Dublin, but believe it or not, he had a huge impact on the area around Goldenbridge and Kilmainham, with the building of Richmond Barracks and the cemetery. Now, you can see the cemetery, it's wedged in there between the Grand Canal and the barracks. And that barracks was built to hold up to 1,600 troops. We know there are times there was an awful lot of overcrowding, and it would have held an awful lot more. Now you can see that little triangle there, that little red triangle there, that little part of that ground was held, and I presume it still is held, by the War Department. And the War Department wanted to have control over what was happening inside the cemetery, and they could exercise that. And as it turned out, in the 1860s, the army were so infuriated with the noisiness of the funerals going up Vincent Street into the cemetery that they put pressure on the cemetery committee to actually not to sell any more new plots, but to just confine burials to those who already owned plots within the cemetery. Now, this was first thing was done. The wall had to be built around the cemetery. Now, this is the penal laws were done away with in April 1829. By May 1829, this foundation stone was been laid right in the to commemorate the cemetery. Now, the first thing that had to be done was a high wall all around the cemetery. Not that the corpses were going to escape, for fear of grave robbers. And also, Daniel O'Connell, he didn't want a church. What he built was a mortuary chapel because he wanted a cemetery that was to be for all religions and no religions. And you see that terraced area in front there? Underneath there, there's a cellar. And in that cellar, there was an arsenal of arms and batons. Uh, that's where the sentries went. The sentries actually kept control or patrol of the cemetery. And also there was a dogs. They had a number of dogs which they used, Cuban wolfhounds, to patrol the cemetery at night. because there was a genuine fear of grave robbers. They, the sack 'em ups, the resurrectionists. Now, Ireland, well, particularly Dublin, had a huge export industry going in exporting corpses to the University of Paris, to London, to Edinburgh. We were notorious for it. The grave diggers would arrive during the night, they would take the corpse, and it'd be just taken straight away over to one of the universities. The sentries, excuse me, we reckon at some stage they had to be involved, they knew what was going on. And these are the Cuban wolfhounds. Now, these were built specifically, excuse me, to track down escaped slaves in the Americas. So they're quite vicious. Excuse me, and there was a number of those still around in Glasnevin cemeteries right up to say Glasnevin Cemetery right up to the 1850s. This is the watchtower. Excuse me. In Glasnevin Cemetery, built specifically to guard against the resurrectionists. Excuse me. Now, this is one of the first accounts of grave digging in or grave robbing in Dublin, 1723, when somebody, Richard Fox, he took a body. He was the sexton. He engaged in helping the resurrectionists. They robbed the body, and he was sentenced to. Well, he escaped while he's awaiting trial, and then in 1742, another guy was also caught, but he escaped as well from there. Excuse me. Now, you were training surgeons. Surgeons had to learn somewhere. We know that there was a famous surgeon down in Dawson Street, and he used to give his lessons on anatomy in his own house, and he'd allowed the poor of the parish to look in when he was giving the anatomy lessons. And it said that people would arrive with their relations, dead relations, and give them to him, for dissection purposes, And we also know that people were proud. Well, the Dublin saying, he'd sell his granny. We know that we know certainly of a number of men who sold their wives to dissection theatres. We also suppose that other people sold their relations as well. Now, at the time, the only legal way to procure a body was if somebody had been hung for murder. Now, this is the anatomy house in Trinity College there. Excuse me, you can see it there going along there. Quite big, quite spacious. Could accommodate up to 25 dissecting tables. You have to ask yourself, where were the bodies coming from? This is the College of Surgeons, very spacious anatomy theatres. Then there was also a number of private anatomy schools. This was on Peter Street, beside or where on the side of the old Adelaide Hospital. This is the Ledwood School of Anatomy. There was private schools, and the students had to supply their own corpses. And this is an advertisement for it. In the new dissecting room, the greatest possible effort has been made to render it spacious, well lighted, perfectly ventilated, at the same time commodious. The dissecting rooms are lighted with gas, so as to furnish the industrious pupil during the winter months with an opportunity of pursuing his labour at any time between 6 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock at night. One of the first places in Dublin to be lighted by gas was a private college specialising in anatomy, right? Also, surgeons had to learn, because you have to remember, after the Henry VIII closed the monasteries, an awful lot of these monasteries were also hospitals. They looked after the sick and the dying and tended to deal in that. And for a long time, there were no hospitals in Dublin. And then you had the establishment of, say, Mercer's Hospital in 1734. You had Swift's Hospital, you had the Meath Hospital. So in the early 17th century, hospitals were being established, usually on private money. Like if you look at Stevens Hospital, Dr. Stevens left the money to his sister Griselle, and she used to build a hospital. Dean Swift in 1746 left money. He said he gave what little money he had to open a hospital for good and mad. So he had all that there. So these private hospitals were being established. Now, this is an anatomy school in London. Now, it's in an attic, or it could be a shed. But on the and these are the students studying. There on the wall, prices for bodies, male, female, and infant. The infants, by the way, were bought by the inches. That's the way it was then. Now, why did the government turn a blind eye to body snatching? The reason quite simple. and this is the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. Most battles then were fought hand to hand. They were very close. You needed surgeons in the army. At Waterloo, they reckon they needed up to 100 surgeons to look after the number, and that's only the Allied side, not counting Napoleon's side. You needed up to 100 surgeons there, right? And they were kept on the go all the time, usually to perform amputations. That was their main raison d'etre. So that's why they were. So you had all this close hand-to-hand combat. You also had naval battles. So surgeons had to go on ships as well. So that was quite important. So you needed all these trained personnel. So that's why the government didn't do an awful lot to deter anybody from snatching a body. And there were very, very few prosecutions. And not only was it demand for the corpses from surgeons, in 1815, the government decided that chemists uh, needed to learn something about anatomy. So a chemist, or they had to undergo some sort of training in dissection. And then shortly after that, in the 1820s, the College of Arts, the Royal Academy in London, decided that students need to know something about dissecting, about drawing cadavers and things like that. So there was further demand there on corpses. So not only had you got the surgeons and the doctors, you also had the chemists and the artists looking for the bodies. Now, it wasn't all provided by natural death. We know that because these are two guys, two Irish guys. Now, all of this body snatching and the selling of bodies in Ireland and Britain was mainly done by the Irish mafia. The name Murphy occurs quite a lot. And these are two guys, Burke from County Tyrone, Hare from Armagh, and they were caught for murdering, we know, well, they were caught for 17 people, but they reckon it could be up to 10 times more than that. That's what they were caught for. One of them was sentenced to be hanged. Both were sentenced to be hanged. Now, this is the man that they actually were providing the corpses for. Surgeon Knox. Did anything happen to Surgeon Knox? No. He had to leave. This was happening in Edinburgh. He had to leave Edinburgh, and he set up a very successful practice then in London. So no repercussions for the surgeon, even though he was the guy who was practically encouraging the murdering of these people. There you can see the murdering there, the crowds thing. Hare, by the way, went King's Evidence, and he came back to Ireland. And the rumor is that, or the story goes, that he ended up in a workhouse himself, and he ended up going on the dissection table at some stage. Now, what really set people worried about this was in 1831, a young 12-year-old Carlo Ferrari was murdered in London. Three lads brought the corpse to King's College Hospital in London. They tried to sell it. Now, the porter was looking at the corpse, and he saw that there was no way that this corpse had ever been interred. And he told the lads to come back for their money. When they came back for their money, he had the police waiting, and the lads were arrested and charged with the murder of the young lads. And of course, Parliament were reacting in all sorts of way, and they decided then that it was okay. They would bring in a law they called the Anatomy Act that came into force in 1842, which allowed for bodies of prisoners who were unclaimed prisoners, and also from people who died in workhouse, that they could be used for dissecting purposes. And of course, then there was further problems about that. They said, well, how come it's only all the poor people are going to be used for medical science? Why can't the rich people be used as well? But eventually the act went through. But I mean, the body snatching was still going on for a good number of years after that. This is William the Fourth. It was him who brought in the Anatomy Act. Now, what does a body snatcher look like? There's one there. That's Sir Dominic Corrigan. By the way, his portrait is down in the College of Physicians in Kildare Street, and there's a lovely bust of him down there. By the way, if you're ever in the College of Science or the medical place, you will see fantastic portraits of people, right? Remember, up until the 1830s, if you see a portrait, or 1840s even, and you see portraits of these guys, you can guarantee at one stage they were body snatchers. That's how they had to learn their trade as it was at the time. So this is a thing. One occasion, Corrigan and some of his fellow students, they intended to rob a corpse of a man buried in Bully's Acre. However, when they got there, the grave was being guarded by the man's widow. The students proceeded to guarantee the safety of the grave and took up a collection for the woman as a mark of their respect. He ended up being a member of the board of Glasnevin Cemetery, and he gave strict instructions that when he was being buried, that there was to be people at the grave mixing what he called Parisian concrete, and that was to be poured over him because he still didn't trust anybody, even at that stage. So we know who these people are. By the way, they made the collection, but we know that he left with two other bodies from Bully's Acre that night as well. Okay, now in back now to Golden Bridge. When Golden Bridge was established in 1829, the same situation arose that happened to Napoleon in Père Lachaise in Paris. You needed a virgin, and it was a girl. Uh, Margaret Lowry had died. She was from Watling Street. Her father was a skinner. She was the first to be buried in the cemetery up there. There's her gravestone in the centre there. And on her right is the gravestone there, and it's covered with ivy. Now, it took me a while to figure out what it was. And there is there, and I'll read out what it says. This stone was erected by the parishioners of St. James to the memory of the Reverend Joseph James Callan, in testimony of their respect for his worth and zeal, in admiration for the kindness as a curatel he displayed among them. He died the 8th of February 1815, and he aged 68 years, and he was buried there in 1829. So this guy was one of the people who was disinterred in order to facilitate the opening of the graveyard. And we also know that there was another priest, Father Sylvester Whelan from Dolphin's Barn. He had been buried under the church. He was disinterred as well, and he was brought up to the cemetery as well. Apparently, there was great. There was bands on all played when he was been brought up, like so he was much the same day. Now, by the way, the reason, Mark, all the tombstones here, by the way, they face east because on the day of judgment, we'll all face towards Jerusalem, and we'll all be called for Maker. But the priest is done back to front because the priest will arise facing his congregation. That's I think it's the theology, but that's the way the thinking is about that, But it's also very interesting when you go up there. I said that Margaret Larry's father was a skinner. You've got different trades there, wheelwrights and things like that that you wouldn't know, because I said for a long time the tradition of being buried there or visiting the graves didn't exist. So you get quite a lot of history in the names of places as well. This is it's great, and also when you go up there. Up in 1829, Catholics couldn't show their wealth. They daredn't show their wealth, and what they couldn't show in life, they were certainly going to show in death. And you go up to the cemetery, some of the tombstones are nearly 8 foot high. They would have been 8 foot high and 4 foot wide. They're huge, big slabs of stone, that people put up at the time. And they're there, as I said, you can see them. And we've been blessed because it wasn't the graveyard that was used, and because it was overgrown by high trees, the weather didn't get a chance to do an awful lot of damage and erode much of the names as we go up there. The other thing you'll notice as well, when Catholic churches started to be built, we started getting the names of new saints and all that. You have to remember when Golden Bridge opened, most people went to their local saint, whether it be Patrick, Bridget, Columba. In Cork, it might be St. Gobnet, and Kerry, it might be St. Brendan, Donegal might be St. Columkill, Galway, St. MacDara. It was all local saints. But then with new churches, you had more exotic saints coming in from faraway lands, which we didn't have there. So you don't see much of this. Uh, Many saints been represented there. Now, the graveyard also had a connection with the barracks. Now, most of the soldiers who died, they would have been repatriated back to England, and there was also military cemeteries in Dublin, by the way. And but this is Margaret Tuckwell. Her father was the bandmaster, and she was 2 years and 8 months when she died, and she's buried here. Now, her father and her mother went back to England. They were from Cheshire, and the father opened a music shop. Unfortunately, he went bankrupt and ended up in the poorhouse. But if you see, and there's a graveyard beside that from another sergeant, and his child was 4 years old at the time, So you also have that. So there's a connection between the barracks and the graveyard. Now, other graveyards as you go around Dublin, normally we don't associate Trinity College with a graveyard. Very few, if you ask anybody, say no. But at the back of the chapel in Trinity College, right beside the cash machine, cash dispenser, there's a little graveyard called Challoner's Corner. It's probably one of the smallest graveyards cemeteries in the world. And there's a number of people buried there, and they all have associations with the college. Now, this is Cork Street, the old Quaker cemetery. There's only two stones standing now at this stage. It stays from about the 1818. And one of the things you notice about it, on the Quaker tombstones, they don't mention the months of the year or the days of the week, because some of them are of pagan origin, like January Janus, Thor, Thursday, the Norse god. So they don't have that. So what you have there is, say, the sixth day of the eighth month and things like that. And you get names in there like Pims, who used to own a department store, Moss, Bewley's and all that. So Quaker names that we associate readily with Dublin. The Huguenots, they certainly had three cemeteries in Dublin. This is probably the most famous one of all. Now, the Huguenots were French Protestants. They were put out of France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1680. Uh, a lot of them went to London. They were great tradespeople. They were silversmiths. They were weavers. And Dublin Corporation at the time, they wanted to attract the skills of these people. And they did like what the IDA does today. They offered these people a chance to come over here, and they gave them certain tax exemptions. So a lot of them came over. They established a very successful weaving industry, and of course the goldsmithing and things like that. So this is one of their graveyards. There's 1693. There's a big plaque to all those who are buried inside, and I think the last burial there took place there in 1912. This was another cemetery that the Huguenots had. This was in Peter Street, where the dissecting school was. And now there weren't that many. If there was 280 buried there, like, and they were from 1711 to 1967. Now, the closure of this cemetery caused a lot of debate in Dáil Éireann at the time, because people were fearful that you were going, or the TDs were fearful that you were going to get a set of precedent of closing down the cemetery. So there's a lot of talk went into this. Now, it was bought by Jacobs, who wanted to expand their factory, and it had only been bought by them when they decided that they were going to move to Tallaght, so they never really used it to begin with. This is the Jewish cemetery in Ballybuck. Now, the Jewish cemetery in Ballybuck dates from about 1717. They had their own before anybody else, and you can see the date there. Now, the date there, it's 1847 and 5618. That's the day from the day of the flood. Noah's Ark on the day of the flood. So you have that date there, like, Now, that closed about the early 1900s, because at that stage the Jewish community had moved around the South Circular Road. We used to know as Little Jerusalem, and they had their own cemetery there up in Dolphin's Barn, which is still there today off Ockavana Road. Then in 1836, you had the Protestant cemetery. You had Mount Jerome, again, garden type cemetery, mainly for Protestants. And it wasn't until there was a grave, what they call a grave digger strike in Glasnevin in the 1920s, that Catholics started to be accommodated in there. You can see it. It's a thing, and it's worth the wealth of design and all that as you go in and go around this cemetery is really worth seeing. Now, this is another view of St. Mary's. You can see the way the headstones have been just laid down. They're just really been walked on. But at least the fourth erosion of the names, and some of them have actually they had family coats of arms which have been completely eroded because of what happened, and you can see there it just becomes a fairground at some stage. Now, by the way, some private orders as well. This is a Mount Dargus, the Passionist priests. To the right of that, they have their own cemetery, and a number of religious orders throughout the city had their own burial places. Now, an awful lot have been removed quietly of late, and the land sold for development purposes, right throughout the city. This is the Harvey Memorial. This is in Mount Jerome. It's quite beautiful. Mr. Harvey, he was drowning. His dog went to the side of the river and started howling until help came along. I don't think it did any good. But when the dog died, he was buried with his master. So it's worth going up to see that in Mount Jerome itself. And then back to Goldenbridge itself. By the way, that just finish here. The mortuary chapel there, it was designed by Patrick Bourne, and you can see other examples of his work. He did St. Audience in High Street, Mary Immaculate in Rathmines, St. Paul's and Ireland Quay. He did James Street Church. So he did quite a lot of churches around the city. So that's it. So I'd welcome your comments or whatever else you would like to say, or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, so much. That was absolutely fascinating, and so many stories connected with all of those different graveyards. So now is your opportunity to ask Pat any questions you might have. First of all, Carol says, my great-grandfather died in 1909 in the Richmond Asylum. I haven't been able to locate a record of his burial. Wood, mass, or pauper burials have been popular. His wife is buried in the Bluebell Cemetery.
There should be a record. Anyone that was buried within an asylum, there should be a record there of a thing. It just made doubt if somebody was buried from there. There was St. George's Cemetery on Whitworth Road that was also used. They had a certain section there, but Glasnevin would have been. They had a paupers plot up there. Now, but we also know that the asylum also had, and this has been covered recently when they were doing the tracks there for the Lewis, extending the Lewis out to Broombridge. We also know that they came across a mass grave, but that would have gone back much further than that. But there should be records of all of those burials around, like when they were interred and where they go. Now, sometimes, you see, they had the problem as well. If the person was buried in a Protestant cemetery, and this happened quite a lot, that the Protestant clergy were meticulous maintaining order, keep maintaining records of their own flock who died, but very often the Catholic wasn't Catholic. People, they weren't recorded at all, and that leads to problems. So, say somewhere like where I mentioned James's Street there, where we know that sometimes it was left to the Catholic clergyman to record the death of somebody buried in James's Street. And because he wasn't getting the money, he may not have bothered. So that you had that as well going on. But there certainly should be some record of all burials that took place, especially around that time, because it'd be very, very unusual if it didn't.
Where might people find those records if anyone's looking? Where's the best place to go?
There's a website, the Irish Genealogical. They've got a website, and they've recorded most of the cemeteries around Dublin. We can put this up afterwards, and you can see all the tombstones. Now, as it happened, most poor people wouldn't have tombstones, but I mean, if you go into Glasnevin Cemetery, they are more than helpful. Most of the cemeteries are. They will give you the help. St. James's, they did a false course there a number of years ago, and they've put what information they had online, so that's also available there. If it's Church of Ireland, the Church of Ireland library up in Rathmines, they have a record of all their burials as well. They're intermittent, and by the way, some of the records were actually destroyed when the Public Records Office was destroyed in 1922 during the Civil War. So that was a great loss to Irish genealogy. So that was a major problem for everybody then at that stage. So sometimes those records do get lost, but most of them are being recorded and they're being digitized, by the people looking after them.
Thank you. Question here from Michelle. I was in Goldenbridge before the lockdown, September 2019. Has any work been done in that cemetery since? The ground is very uneven and stones askew. I seem to recall seeing signs that it belongs to the Glasnevin Trust and it was to be rehabilitated. It's a fascinating cemetery. Thank you.
Work is going on. It's a constant thing. But the thing about it is, the way we talk about our Georgian squares, we talk about Merrion Square and Fitzwilliam Square, and Stephen's Green. And in some ways, Goldenbridge Cemetery is like one of those precious squares because it was out of the public consciousness for so long. It's almost one of those perfect little gems that you want to try and preserve as much as you can. Now I know people we're trying at the moment, to take down the ivy that's going on at the moment. We're trying to make it safe for people to come through. The Glasnevin Trust have started to sell plots now, and a number of people have been buried there recently. So with that happening and the footfall increasing, the cemetery committee are putting more and more effort into doing as much as they can to reinstate the footpaths and all that to make it safer for people, but yet at the same time to preserve as much of the original cemetery as we possibly can in the process.
Thank you. And the Glasnevin Trust may have more information as well if you want to find out more about the work going on there. Kind of off the back of that, Someone asks, do you ever do guided walks of any of these cemeteries? Pat, do you know of any other guided walks going on in any of the other cemeteries?
Well, there's the Bully's Acre, the oldest one in Dublin, and the Border Works once a month. They run guided walks through there. Now, it's very hard to get your name down on that because it's limited number. But if you see that coming up, just scour the OPW site. That's well worth doing. Glasnevin Cemetery is well worth doing. Now and again they do tours of Mount Jerome, and that's worth doing because when you see there, it's the great and the good. You've got the Guinness family, you've got all sorts of people like with military connections, all sorts of the governesses and everything. It's really an incredible place. But just to walk around yourself, it's incredible. To see the signs, of the thing. Or particularly Mr. Drummond, there's a statue of him in City Hall. He invented some sort of light that's used in lighthouses and all that, but he loved Ireland, and written on his huge big gravestone, it's a big, huge big lump of stone, and he said his last words were, "Bury me in Ireland." God, every time I go by that, shouldn't smile, but I do think. But that's it. So as you're going through, it's quite there's so much in Mount Jerome, especially the older cemeteries. There's an awful lot there, and addresses. When you come up to Golden Bridge, you've got say like Elephant Lane. Where's Elephant Lane? It doesn't exist anymore on the map, but it's actually where Cathedral Street was off O'Connell Street. You've got Petticoat Lane, which was Beresford Street. You've got Barrack Street, which is Benburb Street. And as you go around, you're discovering all these addresses, you one time they were on a map, and then you decide, oh, well, these are people who live there. Which is nice thing, and then also you see somebody, if you're been buried there, you had to have money in Golden Bridge, and you see somebody like living in Watling Street and places that Skinner, place that you wouldn't associate people with having money, but it's quite surprising that where people lived and the money they had, especially to be able to put up the big headstones that they had, you know.
Thank you. Got masses of questions coming in, so thank you, everyone. We might even go on an extra 5 minutes just to try and get to as many as we can. Question here from Richard. Whilst researching ancestors buried in Goldenbridge Cemetery, I found one grave that contained 15 burials over a 74-year period from 1830 to 1904. Am I right in suspecting that to accommodate that many people, that coffins weren't used?
Coffins, the notion of coffins, it's a very Victorian idea that people had to be buried in coffin, because we know that for quite a long time, Christian burials, they took place in a cloth, and we know that from medieval times that there were certain stipulations as the type of cloth that could be used or should be used, that there was no mention made, when you go back to medieval times and, to nearly modern times, of the type of wood that would be used for a coffin. So you're quite right that quite a lot of burials would have taken place with just a shroud, and with a cloth that would have be thing. And I said it was somewhere late about the 1860s that it became a stipulation that a coffin be used for burying the dead. You know, and by the way, that came in with the Anatomy Act, the Autopsy Act, and things like that, in case the police want to access a corpse in case there had been some sort of foul play or there was poisoning or something like that. So it was all wound into something else, it wasn't done on its own accord, and then of course the rich people always they want the coffin, and the famous grave in Mount Jerome where somebody had a bell in case she was buried alive. So you got that, and there was, she paid for somebody to stay by her grave for something like 4 weeks after she had died, just in case she rang that bell and she was buried alive by mistake. So you had that. But as I said, it wouldn't have been, but because in those days there was no records kept, and I mean, I heard somebody been buried in the Mount Jerome, and they said, and you're talking about the late mid 60s, they said that the coffin, you could put your little finger down and feel the top of the coffin. So that will tell you, they weren't up to fuss, so they waited until subsidence had taken place. And, over that period of time, there would have been a good depth. But I mean, nowadays, I think it used to be the maximum of 6 were allowed in a grave. I think it might be even less now.
A couple of questions here, again, going back to the death records about the best place to go to. One person whose great-grandfather died in 1932 in St. Itas or St. Eaters, apologies if I mispronounced that. And somebody else, just trying to find the question here. So trying to find burial records for Her father's family, who lived off Mount Street, and her grandfather died around 1952. Could they possibly be buried in Mount Jerome, or where might be a good place to go? So where can people go if they're would the Glasnevin Trust be the best place to go,
They
or is
would
there
have
anywhere?
them, but I mean, you could start if you knew the date. I mean, if you're buried in Mount Street, you're either buried at Western Road Church. It's probably the place that you would be buried. So you go there, or if you're a Church of Ireland, you go to St. Stephen's there in Mount Street Crescent. So you would be able to look it up there. That's always a good starting place if you know the church. You know, and there's also St. Mark's Church, excuse me, there on Pearse Street. All of these records, by the way, are in St. Anne's Church in Dawson Street if you want to go and see them. And I mean, if the Verger is there on the day, you can have access to them. Failing that, you can go up to the Church of Ireland Library, but it's always a good place to start, But there's a record of all of these bears. They all have to be recorded, so that you should know by following the records where they are. And the other thing as well is that, I mean, newspaper notices, you know. And the other thing, if it was from around Mount Street and all that. Just who are the undertakers serving there? So the chances are it was probably Nichols and Lombard Street because they've been on the go a long time. So if you go down to Nichols, they might have some record of it if you knew the name. There's also Corrigan's. I mean, they're around a long time. They're in Anger Street and what's it? Fannigan's in Anger Street. Sorry, Corrigan's is in Wexford Street. Is it? So all of those, the undertakers have those records. So there's loads of places that you can go if you want to begin your search, you know, and people are only too happy to help,
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here about Robert Emmet and your theory about where he might be buried. So Eric expands on that and says, where do you think he might be buried? In my childhood, there was a theory that he was buried in the Trevor Vault in St. Paul's, North King Street, which is now an enterprise centre, and it was found that he wasn't there. So what are your theories?
Well, I know that the Emma family, they had a burial plot in St. Peter's in Anger Street. Church has gone out. It's where the YMCA is now because they lived on Stephen's Green. And one of the theories that was put forward by the Emma family was that Robert Emmet's sister died practically a year after Robert Emmet. And Robert Emmet was buried somewhere, probably in the whereabouts. People say on St. Nicholas Road on the Coombe. Other people say that there's a two. By the way, just go off for a minute. There's what his famous speech from the doc, until Ireland is a nation that no man write my epitaph. In St. Michael's Church in Church Street, there's a tombstone there with no epitaph on it, and people have said that's where he's buried. Other people said St. Catherine's, and but the Emmet family believed that he was buried in St. Peter's in Anger Street. And Thomas Addiseb, who would have been a great nephew of him, he was in Ireland in 1903 for the centenary celebrations, or commemoration, not celebrations, commemoration of the execution of Robert Emmet. And he arranged for an excavation in St. Peter's Church in Anger Street. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't think they found anything, but I mean, at that stage, uh, I don't know if even there would have been an awful lot, to find at that stage because there would have been just so much, what got it, messing over there over the years because so many people would have been buried there because it was a very small, confined graveyard. I don't know if you remember, but it was really, really tiny, and there would have been a lot of interaction between graves like at that stage. So that's there. But I know when they were doing the St. Nicholas Road on the Coombe was another place that was mentioned. And I know they were looking at that and they came across bones in a tomb, but on the crypt, underneath the crypt, and they thought that these might be Robert Emmet. But what had happened was they stored a lot of bones in a sack, instead of separating them. And what happened was the DNA would just become so fractious and all that it couldn't be used with any sort of certainty. So there was a lost opportunity there to say once and for all where he was actually buried. So the truth is, probably we'll never really know that where he was buried.
A rather gruesome question here. What did the surgical schools do with the bodies when they were finished with them?
This is well for the private schools I was talking about, the Ledwith one in Peter Street. We know when the Adelaide Hospital was putting on an extension in the 1960s, they went to put in the foundations, dug out a cellar, and they discovered hundreds of bones from various skeletons. Uh, we also know that there were various dung hills around the city, and it wasn't uncommon for corpses to be buried or to be found on top of them. So there was very little care taken with them. Thing they weren't shown much respect. We know that, from records, so when the students are finished with them, anything could happen to them, so they might have a charnel, they might just set them on fire, there was absolutely no control, no respect, nothing, no criteria that to be buried or anything done with them. So we know that they just ended up whichever the student wanted to get rid of them.
We're going to go over for another 5 minutes or so just to try and get another couple of questions in. There are a couple of questions about the Jewish cemetery in Ballybock. Firstly, a question about could you talk a little bit more about it? Do you know any more? Maybe could you repeat what you said about the dates and how it was connected with Noah's Ark? And another question just about whether you know if there's been any work done in there lately, because it was announced 3 or 4 years back. I believe that question's related to the Ballybock Cemetery. Apologies if I've got that wrong.
First of all, as I said, the cemetery, it's not an overly used cemetery, and the city council, they did commission a report which was done, and they're trying to come up to some way to actually use the cemetery in a way that's useful to the community, but at the same time affording the dignity that's required to the people who are buried there. So they're trying to do something along that regard. And also there's the caretaker's house, which the plaque on it, what's I said, 5692, which was the Jewish year for after the flood. So that would be the date that would be used there. So I know there are plans afoot to do something with it. I said the report is fairly detailed. It's available online if you want to read it. There's definitely an initiative, and I know money has been set aside by the city council in order to do something with it. And also they've received private donations from individuals, who are intent upon seeing that it's secured as a community space for the people who live around there. So as I said, the thing is respect, and the same thing as well as the the people who are buried there, some of the relatives, they want to try and contact them, see if they want to have the remains reinterred up in the Dolphins Barn Cemetery. So there's been some negotiation on about that as well. So it's one of these things that it's a long drawn out process, but certainly I know that the city council are anxious to proceed, do something positive with it. Give it to the community. The Jewish community themselves are interested in seeing that it's used for the community, as a place of recreation and contemplation and a nice bit of greenery that local people can enjoy. So that's what they're working on at the moment,
Yeah. I suppose it would be worth if you have any further questions about that or the upkeep of the city council owned cemeteries, best to get in touch with Dublin City Council for the most up to date information. Another question here from Donal. A really terrific talk, excellent. I was told on a tour of Dean's Grange that Protestant graves can be identified because they don't have crosses on them, whereas Roman Catholic ones do. Is this usual in every graveyard?
No, if you go up to Mount Jerome, it's really Protestant. You've got crosses, you've got all sorts, so there's no way. But I know in Dean's Grange, there used to be a Protestant section at one stage in Dean's Grange, but there's certainly no prohibition, because if you go to Protestant cemeteries anywhere in England, you see crucifixes, and things quite a lot of them. So they're quite common. And you also have to remember that in say Mount Jerome, there was this when the Oxford movement was taking place, the Anglo-Protestant, when they were trying to be more Romanish in the church, that an awful lot of this crucifix. Now you don't see figures of Christ or anything like that on them, they tend to be fairly simple and dignified, but you do see an awful lot of urns, so they're more about the person, the afterlife and things like that, and they do tend to have prayers on them, which is quite a lot, and pieces from the 23rd Psalm and all things like that. So there's quite a lot. But no, if you go to Mount Jerome, it'll completely discount that theory.
From Denise, an ancestor of mine was transported to Australia in the early 1830s for highway robbery, and a newspaper article at the time said he was part of a resurrectionist gang, some of whom were involved in the robbery. What was the gang you mentioned? She missed the name.
The resurrectionists. Well, you see, there There was a famous Nangle was his name. He was caught in the 1830s. Hope he's not your relation, but he was caught in the with a corpse, and they chased him from St. Kevin's graveyard there, off Camden Street there, and he wasn't caught till he reached Thomas Street, and he actually had the body of a young girl with him, so that was a thing. But they did, they did, deport people to Australia for the simplest reasons, And the thing about it is, if he was anyway young or fit, the chances are that he would have been deported because they're really anxious to populate Australia. So if you were old, you didn't go infirm or anything like that, they weren't going to send you to Australia. So if your relation was sent there, the chances are that he was in fine fettle, and the great health and all that, But yeah, the resurrections, they would groups gone around Dublin, and but they didn't only operate. I mean, when you think of they didn't discriminate. They went to Protestant graveyard, Catholic graveyards, Bully's Acres. We don't know how many were taken from the military cemeteries. There was quite. I mean, as I said, if you look at it, I remember one time reading a report, and there was more people that died in one year than were actually buried. You say to yourself, where did all these bodies go? They had to go somewhere, and they weren't being buried at sea, so something had to happen to them. So, yeah, but there was no specific name for the gang, but they did all operate, very close together, and they operated in cahoots with the colleges of surgery, whether it be the Royal College of Physicians, whether it be the College of Surgeons, whether it be Trinity Anatomy, whether it be the private the private colleges. And we know that certain colleges in Liverpool, there's a guy called Murphy, and he got a retainer from certain colleges. He was given some £5 or something a year in order to provide corpses. Then he was paid by the corpse that he provided. And we know that he operated for a long number of years, and he was very precious there. Anybody step into his territory, and he had this gang going in London for, as they years, and God knows how many hundreds of corpses he would have sold to the schools of anatomy in London. He just didn't care, and he took them. So I said, it was quite a big business, it's
Mm.
at the time, So I don't know of any specific gang name, but I know that certain, if you look through the newspapers, you can certainly see that certain people were involved, Mr. Nangle is the most famous one that I know of, because his persistence, I don't think that deterred him. The fact that he was caught, he was caught a number of times engaging in the same thing.
Another couple of comments and questions here about Goldenbridge specifically. Firstly, Irene says, most of my ancestors are buried in Goldenbridge. The young boy who was shot in 1916 was my
Right.
uncle, Eugene Lynch, who
Yeah.
died 8 years old. And there was a memorial in 2016 and he got a headstone. And another question, is there a president of Ireland buried in Goldenbridge?
Yeah, the Cosgrave, the first president of the executive, which would technically be the president of Ireland, he's buried there. His family, they lived in James Street, so they had a burial plot there. And Liam Cosgrave, who was the Taoiseach, he was buried there. But he didn't have he didn't have a state funeral. It was very simple. And like Eugene Lynch, the boy in 1916, when he was buried, there was only two people at his funeral because of the curfew, which is really sad. But when the memorial was put up, um, though I think there was over 200 turned up that day, which was quite nice. Now, the other thing as well is if you look at Eugene Lynch's memorial, once you put up a memorial on a tombstone or on a grave, you're expected to put up the names of all of the people who are buried there. I know people who have bought, their family have been buried in paupers' plots in Glasnevin. But if you go to put up a memorial, you have to put up the name of all of the people who are buried in that plot, not just their own family's names. And you have to give them all equal size lettering as a thing. So you're commemorating their life as well. So you just think I saw in the cemetery, I was going through a cemetery, and it says, if you can claim a plot if your relation is buried there, you know, it sounds like you're going for nothing, but I mean, when you go to put up the tombstone, you have to buy it off them. It can be cost an awful lot to do that, So it's one of the little things that you have to do,
Thank you. I think we'll go with two more and then we'll wrap up. So, firstly, from David, thanks very much. Very informative. Do you know where the biggest British military graveyards were in Dublin? Listening in from Ballincollig, Cork, where there was a big barracks, and there's a British military cemetery here. There's a couple of people from Cork here this evening, so you're very welcome.
Right, so I was actually out with a man from Richmond Hill in Cork City there the other day, walking with him. Yeah, the one in Arba Hill would have been one, and there's also one in Grange Gorman. So they would have been quite big military cemeteries. And there's also one in the Royal Hospital, you know, and they may not be big in size, but if you take the Royal Hospital, I mean, it's gone since about 1670 until 1922 when the last people were moved out of there. It's not that big, but there would have been thousands of people been buried there, like, you know, that so we'd have the records with them. So you would have had them around Dublin, like, you know. And I said you had the Croppies Acre, which is on the Keys, where the remains of the lads from 1798 rebellion, they were supposed to be buried in a mass grave there, you know, so you had that as well as you go through the city, like, you know. But I mean, all the time, a couple of years ago, when Dunn Stores were building their headquarters in off Georgia Street there was a small little Viking. There was 4 Viking bodies found behind the Long Hall pub there, like, you know, and we were able to tell where they actually came from. One was from Norway, one was from Scotland, like, you know, by looking at their teeth, like, you know, it's quite a thing. So yeah, there's are a number of military graveyards around Dublin, like, you know, and sometimes there's, you know, the URIC and Dublin Metropolitan Police, they have their own graveyards as well, like, you know, so there's right around our plots in graveyards, like, you know, so you have that as well. But also in Goldenbridge itself, there are a number of military personnel who would be buried there. And also, by the way, a number of military personnel, their names appear on gravestones, but they're not actually buried there. They could have died in the First War, the Second War. They could have died in Canada, and their names are put on tombstones here. So they may not actually be interred in the grave, you know. So that's
Thank you.
thing.
I think we'll wrap up with this. There's been a couple of questions about this, and it's just, dear, can you recommend any books that people could read about various cemeteries in Dublin? What are the best books on Dublin's graveyards? And someone asks, what's Pat's best method for reading eroded headstone inscriptions? And has he heard of laser readers that might help in the future?
No, before an awful lot of, I think around the 1890s, the Church of Ireland now did record a lot of headstones, and these are available. Sometimes people go and they do these things like, you know, they try to reinvent the wheel. Just check first of all, you know, with your local county council office or your local church offices, have these already been recorded, like, you know. But I know that certainly people, I've seen this, that people use laser thing, and they can tell you what was written on the headstone, like, you know. But it's like that one I showed earlier with the skull and crossbones and the time. When you look at that, you know, that should have been taken to a museum at the time, but people weren't, I suppose, thinking at the time, why would you do that? But it's such, you know, craftsmanship and all that, like, you know, it's just, it's unreal, like. And the other thing is the spelling, you know, the way people like field was spelled differently. There's the man was Morph, and there's an MURFF, and there's an EE put in somewhere else, like, you know, so it's just the spelling and the way the spelling goes off. But there's all sorts of ways of tracking down it's more now than ever. Sometimes I go in and I take photographs, and you go home and you try to use different, what they call it, different tones and all that to see what's actually written there, like, you know. But by the way, I was up in Goldenbridge and I did take these photographs, and last November I was looking at photographs and that I take, and I hadn't, you know, the way sometimes you take photographs, you don't realize what you're taking photographs. And I just happened to be there in November looking at the photographs, 11 o'clock in the morning, and I see the name Patrick Garry and his wife Mary buried in 1829. So I was looking at that and getting a shock now. But the only thing was my wife's name is not Mary, like, you know, so that was the thing there. So it's amazing when you go up there, actually, the family connections that you do have. You know, it's thing. But also, just tell you this before we go, a couple of years ago, I had an aunt, and she didn't particularly like anybody, like, you know, which was one of those cantankerous old women. She didn't like anybody, and everybody made the effort to make her. But she died. Now, she'd been married a number of times, 5 times, and when she died, she left my cousin 4 burial plots in London. And we thought this was the funniest thing ever. We were slagging him. So we had Highgate, Golders Green, other, you name them. There's four of the most famous cemeteries in Dublin or in London. But we thought this was the funniest thing. And until he went to sell them. And they were worth an absolute fortune. One of the sites that he had, one of the plots that he had, was beside, it's that guy Adams that wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now imagine having a plot beside that guy. You know, he was been offered all sorts of money for the thing. Golders Green, where Bram Stoker's remains are. People were going out of their way to buy things, like, you know. So some of these things are an awful lot more valuable. I wish I had to go along with that land better, like, you know. So he's worth about 200 grand now at this stage from those gravestones, like, you know. So that's a thing. So
Do you have any books to recommend that people
oh
might be
yeah,
able to read?
yeah, just the books. Vivian Igo, uh, wrote a book on Dublin cemeteries. If you're interested in that, and there's also another book. It's it's called Grave Matters, GraveMatters. That's around. So those two books would be. But Igo's one is probably the one with the most specific information about the Dublin graveyards. You know, other ones like they're worth. You know, I mean, the likes the Cabbage Garden, place like that. Just walking around, looking at the graveyard yourself, and see what's around there. Like, you know, bring a camera with you. Nobody is going to complain. Like, you know, and just look at the photographs afterwards when you come back, because it's an insight into the way people, you know, lived, loved, and buried and died and all that, like, you know, in different things, and all the different symbols and all that you see on the graves, like, you know. So and some of these are works of art. Like, I mean, people spend a fortune on their tombs, and if you look, you know, I mean, if you're ever in Venice, the graveyard there, if you go in there, or Milan even, you go in there and the graves in there are just absolutely works of art in themselves. Like, you know, anywhere else they'd be in a museum, but I suppose the graveyard is a museum, but definitely well worth going into to see in places like these, like, you know, and they tell a story about us and ourselves, like, you know.
So all that remains is to thank Pat for a wonderful talk, really, really fascinating, and to thank you all for coming along this evening.